The letter that shouldn't exist for 20 years, my land had been my sanctuary. A wide, open piece of property framed by tall oaks, with a gravel driveway winding up to the old farmhouse I had restored with my own 2 hands. It was far enough from the city to enjoy peace, yet close enough to grab groceries without turning it into a road trip. Most importantly, it was mine. Every inch, every fence post, every blade of grass. No one told me what color to paint my shutters or where I could park my truck. There were no rules, no committees, no strangers with clipboards trying to measure my lawn. It was freedom. At least, it was. Until the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, tucked inside my mailbox on a Wednesday morning. There was nothing unusual about the outside except for the embossed golden logo in the corner, Maple Grove Homeowners Association. At first, I thought it had been misdelivered. The HOA was tied to the gated community half a mile down the road. Rows of identical houses, trimmed hedges, and residents who seemed to enjoy competing over whose lawn was the most symmetrical. I didn't live there. I didn't want to live there. I had zero connection to it. But curiosity got the better of me, so I tore it open. The letter started formally, like any piece of bureaucratic nonsense. Dear homeowner, it read in blocky, overly cheerful font. As part of the Maple Grove HOA community, your property is subject to community standards and regulations. We have identified the following violations. My eyes scanned the list, and by the 3rd bullet point, I was laughing. Apparently, I had unapproved fencing materials, failure to maintain HOA-approved landscaping, and authorized vehicle parking in driveway. It was absurd. My fence was the same weathered cedar it had been for years. My landscaping consisted of wildflowers and a vegetable garden I'd been tending since before half the HOA board probably moved to town. And as for my truck, it was parked exactly where it belonged, my driveway. The punchline? I had never joined their HOA. I had never signed a single document granting them authority over my property. I wasn't in their community by any stretch of the imagination. It was like waking up to find a stranger in your kitchen telling you that you were cooking breakfast wrong. So I crumpled the letter, tossed it into the trash, and didn't give it another thought. 2 days later, the trouble showed up in person. I was on the porch, enjoying the last sips of my morning coffee, when I noticed 3 people standing at the edge of my driveway. 2 men, 1 woman, all dressed in business casual attire, each holding a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. They didn't look like lost neighbors. They looked like people who had come here with a mission. The woman, a short blonde, with a sharp bob haircut and the kind of smug expression that could curdle milk, stepped forward first. "Good morning, sir," she called out, her tone syrupy but with an undercurrent of condescension. "I'm Margaret Whitmore, president of the Maple Grove HOA. We're just here to do a quick property evaluation." I blinked. "For what?" Her smile widened, the way a cat might grin at a trapped mouse. "Well, now that your property is officially within HOA boundaries, we need to ensure it meets our community standards." That word, officially, set off alarms in my head. Within HOA boundaries? Since when? Margaret's eyes lit up like she had been waiting for the question. "We voted last month to incorporate this section of the neighborhood into the HOA. It's really a great opportunity for—" I held up a hand. "Let me stop you right there. This isn't an opportunity. My land isn't part of your HOA. I never signed anything, and you have no authority here." Her smile tightened. "Well, unfortunately, the board has already decided," I laughed, cutting her off again. "Lady, you can't just decide to take someone's property under your control. That's not how the law works." The taller of the 2 men, rail thin with an Adam's apple that bobbed when he swallowed, cleared his throat. "Technically, the HOA has jurisdiction over all properties within the community boundary." I took a slow step closer, my voice low. And steady. And technically, you're trespassing on private property. See that sign on the gate? The one that says no trespassing? That applies to all of you. Silence. Margaret's jaw twitched, her cheerful facade cracking for the first time. "Mr. Carter," she said with forced calm, "we'd like to work with you, but if you refuse to comply, the HOA will take legal action." I grinned. "Good. I can't. Wait to see how that works out for you." Her eyes narrowed. She turned to her clipboard crew and muttered, "Let's go, for now." As they walked back toward the road, I could hear them whispering, occasionally glancing back at me like I was some kind of outlaw. I leaned against the porch railing, watching them go, a cold knot settling in my gut. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Escalation in the dark. I had barely finished my second cup of coffee the next morning when I noticed the first new sign of trouble, literally. A bright orange paper was taped to my fence, flapping in the breeze like some kind of warning flag. From a distance, it looked like a construction permit, but as soon as I stepped closer, I realized it was yet another HOA violation notice. The bold heading read, "Final warning, immediate action required." The absurdity hit me like a bad joke. It accused me, once again, of non-compliance and failure to maintain community-approved standards, listing the same nonsense about fencing, landscaping, and parking. At the bottom was a threat. Failure to address these violations within 7 days will result in fines and further enforcement action. It was signed by none other than Margaret Whitmore, her name written in looping script like she was the queen of some suburban kingdom. I pulled it down, crushed it into a ball, and tossed it into the same trash can where yesterday's letter was already rotting. I told myself it was just another empty gesture. But by the time I finished breakfast, a second notice had been taped to my gate, identical to the first, except this one had copy sent to legal department, stamped across it in red ink. My patience was wearing thin. Over the next week, the harassment snowballed. Every morning, I'd find new violation notices taped somewhere on my property. Sometimes they were on my fence, sometimes wedged in my screen door, sometimes even tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. The tone of each letter became increasingly hostile, threatening everything from mandatory compliance hearings to property seizure. They were throwing legal-sounding phrases around like candy, hoping I'd panic. But I didn't panic. Instead, I called the county records office to confirm, once again, that my land was not, and had never been, under HOA jurisdiction. My deed was clean, my property lines untouched. As far as the law was concerned, Margaret and her band of clipboard warriors had no more authority here than a kid selling lemonade without a permit. Still, something about the way the notices kept coming, multiple times a day now, told me they were building toward something. Margaret wasn't the type to quit just because the law was against her. She had the look of a person who thrived on control, and I knew she wouldn't rest until she'd either won or been humiliated. That suspicion was confirmed 3 nights later. It was close to 2:30 in the morning when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the new security cameras I'd installed around the property. The feed popped up on my screen, and my stomach tightened. There they were, 3 figures moving along the edge of my land, flashlights sweeping over the ground, the beams slicing through the darkness. 2 of them carried clipboards, and one had what looked like a measuring wheel, rolling it slowly across my driveway. They stopped at my fence line, talking quietly, occasionally pointing at my house. I watched them for several minutes, my jaw clenched. This wasn't a friendly property check. This was reconnaissance. They were mapping something out, taking notes, likely planning their next move. I thought about confronting them right then, but I decided against it. The cameras were recording everything, and sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let people dig their own grave. The following day, I called Margaret directly. She answered on the second ring, her voice laced with that same fake sweetness. "Mr. Carter, She said, "I was just about to call you. I'm afraid your non-compliance has forced us to consider stronger measures." "You mean like trespassing on my property in the middle of the night?" I asked. There was a pause. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," I said. "And so will the sheriff when I hand over the footage." Her tone sharpened. "If you escalate this, you'll regret it." I almost laughed. "Margaret, the only thing I regret is not buying a bigger no trespassing sign." She hung up without another word. I didn't have to wait long to see what stronger measures meant. 2 mornings later, I was on the porch again, watching the mist burn off the fields, when a dark SUV rolled slowly up my driveway. It stopped halfway, and 2 men stepped out. They wore all-black uniforms with HOA security enforcement printed across their vests in bold white letters. Each had a badge clipped to his belt and an earpiece coiled along his neck. They walked with the kind of manufactured authority you see in low-budget cop shows, their boots crunching on the gravel like they owned the place. The taller one, broad-shouldered, and wearing sunglasses despite the early hour, strode up first. "James Carter?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just took a long sip from my coffee mug and stared. "You're in direct violation of multiple HOA regulations," he continued. "You've failed to comply with legal notices. We've been authorized to detain you until you agree to attend a compliance hearing." That got my attention. "Detain me?" The second man, thinner and holding a notepad, stepped forward. "If you refuse to come with us, we'll have to escalate this to law enforcement." I set my coffee down, took one slow step toward them, and said, "Which department are you with?" They exchanged a quick glance. The notepad guy cleared his throat. "We're contracted security under the HOA, so—" "Not actual cops," I said flatly. "Sir, you are legally required to comply with," the tall one began, but I cut him off. "No, I'm not. I'm not in your HOA. I never signed any agreement, and this is private land." "Which means you're trespassing." They tried to stand their ground, but the cracks were already showing in their confidence. I could smell their uncertainty, and I decided to push. "You know what?" I said. "Let's call the real police and clear this up." And that was when their bravado started to falter. The real authority steps in. The tall one crossed his arms, his jaw tightening like he thought the pose alone might restore his authority. The thinner one kept darting glances back at the SUV, as if maybe there was someone inside who could rescue him from this conversation. I didn't raise my voice, didn't puff my chest, didn't give them anything they could twist into a claim that I was threatening. I just pulled my phone out of my back pocket, scrolled to the sheriff's office number, and hit the call button. The dispatcher picked up, calm and professional. I turned the phone to speaker so the 2 men could hear every word. "Yeah," I said clearly. "I've got 2 men on my property impersonating law enforcement and claiming they have the authority to detain me. They're wearing tactical vests that say HOA security enforcement. I need a deputy to come down here and sort this out." That got a visible reaction. The tall one's jaw flexed again, but now it looked more like he was grinding his teeth. The thin one's Adam's apple bobbed nervously as he stepped back a few paces. "That's not necessary," he said quickly, his voice pitching higher. "Sure it is," I replied. "You said you'd be happy to escalate to law enforcement. I'm just helping you along." The dispatcher confirmed a unit was on its way, and I hung up without breaking eye contact. We stood there in silence for a few minutes, them pretending they still had a mission to complete, me leaning casually against the porch railing as though I had all day, when the sheriff's cruiser rolled up the driveway, its tires crunching. Over the gravel, both men turned to face it. The driver's door swung open and out stepped Deputy Harris, a man I'd seen around town more times than I could count. Broad-shouldered, weathered face, the kind of steady demeanor that told you he'd dealt with every sort of nonsense this county could throw at him. He took one look at the two in their black uniforms, his brows furrowing immediately. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice flat and unimpressed. The tall one straightened his posture like a kid caught by the principal. "Deputy, we're private security contracted by the Maple Grove HOA. We're here to detain Mr. Carter for repeated non-compliance with." Harris cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. "Let me stop you there. First off, you can't detain anybody. You're not law enforcement. Second, Mr. Carter doesn't even live in your HOA. That's not how it works," the thin one piped up weakly. Harris turned to me. "This true, James? You've got no legal connection to them?" "Not a shred," I said, handing him the folder I'd brought out with me, copies of my deed, county zoning maps, and the stack of bogus violation notices I'd been collecting all week. "They've been harassing me for days, trespassing on my property, and now sending these guys to try and drag me off to some imaginary hearing." Harris skimmed the first page, then snapped it shut. "All right," he said, looking back at the two men. "Here's the situation. You're trespassing. You're impersonating law enforcement, and you're making threats you have no legal right to carry out. That's 3 separate problems, and each of them can land you in a cell." The tall one's confidence finally cracked. "We were just following orders from the HOA board," he said quickly, like maybe that would absolve him. "Yeah," Harris said dryly. "Well, you can follow me down to the station and explain those orders to the booking officer." He motioned for them to put their hands where he could see them, and just as the thin one was hesitating, another vehicle pulled into the driveway, a shiny silver SUV that looked freshly washed, its tires crunching over the gravel like it didn't belong anywhere near dirt. The driver's door swung open and out stepped Margaret Whitmore, her hair perfectly styled, her blouse pressed, and her expression locked into that same smug superiority she'd worn the first day she showed up. She didn't even glance at me at first. Instead, she strode directly toward Harris. "Deputy," she began, her voice dripping with feigned indignation, "I'm glad you're here. We've been dealing with a very difficult resident who refuses to comply with community standards. And my security team was simply—" "Your security team?" Harris interrupted. "Yes," she said, crossing her arms like the matter was settled. "These men are here on behalf of the Maple Grove HOA, which now includes this property." Harris let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, it doesn't. And even if it did, you still wouldn't be able to send people to pretend they're police and haul someone off their porch." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Deputy, with all due respect, with all due respect." "Ma'am," Harris cut in sharply, "I've already seen the documents. I've already been given the security footage. You and your board have no legal authority here, and hiring people to impersonate law enforcement is a criminal offense." That was the first moment her mask truly slipped. I watched the color drain from her face, watched the flicker of uncertainty cross her eyes before she schooled her features back into something resembling defiance. "This is harassment," she said quickly, jabbing a finger in my direction. "He's been hostile to the community for months. He's threatened board members. He's—" "Enough," Harris said flatly. "I'm not interested in your excuses. I'm interested in the fact that your people trespassed onto private property, tried to intimidate a lawful property owner, and are now standing here in tactical vests with badges they're not authorized to carry." Her eyes darted to me for the first time, and I made sure she saw the small, satisfied smile on my face. I didn't have to say anything. The look on her face told me she understood exactly how bad this was going to get for her. Harris glanced at the two men. "Cuff them," he said to the second deputy who had arrived in a second cruiser. The tall one started to protest, but the deputy moved in quick, snapping cold metal around his wrists before he could finish the sentence. The thin one didn't even try to argue. Margaret took a step back. "You can't arrest them, they were just doing their jobs." "They were committing crimes," Harris corrected. "And unless you want to join them right now, I suggest you take a step back and stay quiet." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes burning with frustration, but she didn't move forward again. I leaned one shoulder against the porch. Post, hands in my pockets, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Margaret, you picked the wrong fight." Her glare could have cut glass. "This isn't over," she spat. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "Oh, I know. Because after today, I'm taking this to court." And for the first time since the whole mess started, she actually looked worried. The courtroom reckoning Margaret must have believed that sheer stubbornness could rewrite reality. A week after the arrests, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox, hand-delivered, stamped urgent in bold red letters. Inside was a formal complaint from the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, filed in county court. The pages were heavy with legal jargon, but the accusations were laughable: public nuisance, threat to community safety, willful violation of HOA regulations, and, unbelievably, a demand that my property be forcibly annexed into the HOA's boundaries. Reading through it, I could almost hear her voice dictating each line, dripping with the smug conviction that she was finally going to win. To her, this wasn't about property law or community order. It was about control. I didn't waste time being angry. Instead, I made one phone call to a man I trusted, Richard Bulldog Harlan, a land rights attorney with a reputation for dismantling overreaching bureaucrats and arrogant property boards. Rich was the kind of lawyer who walked into a courtroom as though it were his personal arena. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. "This," he said after glancing at the complaint, "is going to be fun." His grin was a predator's grin, not of malice, but of certainty. We spent the next 2 weeks building our case. Rich had me pull every scrap of documentation I could find: the original deed to my property, county zoning maps, tax records proving my land had never been part of any HOA, and the pile of bogus violation notices they'd plastered on my fence. We added in the security footage: Margaret's board members trespassing at night with flashlights, her hired security pounding on my door and claiming they had detention authority, and the video of Deputy Harris arresting them in my driveway. Every frame, every document, was another nail in the coffin. When the court date arrived, I walked into the county courthouse with Rich at my side. The room smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, a place where egos came to die under the weight of legal precedent. Margaret was already seated at the plaintiff's table, wearing a sharp navy suit and that same practiced expression of superiority. Next to her sat a man in a tailored charcoal suit, the kind of attorney who charged more for an hour than most people made in a week. Margaret didn't look at me as I took my seat at the defense table. That told me everything. She thought she had already won. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for having no patience for theatrics, entered the room. She gave the briefest glance at the case file before sighing in a way that suggested she'd already dealt with too many similar disputes. "Let's get this over with," she said, settling into her seat. Margaret's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor," he began with the practiced cadence of someone who had given the same speech 100 times, "the Maple Grove Homeowners Association has been tirelessly working to maintain the integrity and safety of its community. However, Mr. Carter has repeatedly refused to comply with community regulations, creating an ongoing disturbance and setting a poor example for other residents." The judge raised one eyebrow. "Does Mr. Carter live in the HOA?" Margaret's lawyer hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "His property is within the expanded community boundaries as defined by the HOA board's vote last month." The judge cut him off. "So, no then. He's not a member, correct?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice sharp but controlled. "Your Honor, the HOA voted to incorporate his property, and as such, he is subject to our bylaws. That's not how property law works," the judge said flatly. "An HOA cannot unilaterally expand its jurisdiction to include private land without the owner's consent. Rich rose smoothly to his feet. "Your Honor, if I may?" He slid a stack of documents across to the bailiff, who delivered them to the bench. "These are Mr. Carter's property deed and the official county zoning maps, clearly showing his land is separate from and never has been part of the Maple Grove HOA. In addition, here is certified correspondence from the county property office, confirming there have been no annexations or zoning changes involving his parcel." The judge glanced through the papers and nodded once, her expression unreadable. "Very well, Mr. Harlan, do you have any counterclaims?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rich said without hesitation. "We are filing a countersuit for harassment, trespassing, defamation, and the filing of a frivolous lawsuit. We have security footage, police reports, and multiple witness statements documenting the HOA board's repeated unlawful entry onto my client's property, the employment of unlicensed security personnel to impersonate law enforcement, and ongoing attempts to intimidate him into surrendering rights he legally holds." Margaret's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Margaret herself tried to interject, but the judge held up a hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, you'll have your turn. For now, I'd like to see this evidence." Rich queued up the video on a laptop connected to the courtroom monitor. The footage played in sharp clarity. The late-night trespassing, the flashlight beams sweeping over my land, the hired security pounding on my door, their threats to detain me, and the arrival of Deputy Harris. The final clip, the fake cops being cuffed and Margaret arriving just in time to argue with the deputy, played without interruption. When the screen went dark, the judge exhaled slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her tone calm but edged with steel, "this is one of the most egregious examples of OA overreach I have seen in this courtroom. You have no legal authority over Mr. Carter's property. You cannot fine him, you cannot impose your bylaws on him, and you most certainly cannot send people to impersonate police in an attempt to intimidate him." Margaret's lawyer murmured something to her, but she shook her head, her cheeks flushing with color. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Carter, I am ruling in your favor. Your counterclaims for harassment, trespassing, and emotional distress are granted. The HOA will pay for all your legal fees and is fined $50,000 in damages. This case is dismissed." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Margaret sat frozen, her hands clenched into fists on the table, her carefully maintained composure crumbling around the edges. The HOA board members in the gallery exchanged looks, some whispering to each other with the subtle urgency of people already planning how to replace their leader. I buttoned my jacket, stood, and walked past her table without a word. She didn't look at me, but I knew she could feel my presence as I passed. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper, the air lighter. But I wasn't finished with Margaret Whitmore. Not yet. Turning the verdict into a weapon winning in court had been satisfying, but a simple legal victory was not enough for me. Margaret had made the past month a campaign of intimidation, disruption, and disrespect, and in my mind, a fine and legal fees were only part of the repayment she owed. She had tried to strip away my rights and bully me into submission. Now I intended to use the law and her own arrogance to leave a mark she and the entire Maple Grove HOA would never forget. The $50,000 the court had ordered them to pay was not just a number. It was a resource, a tool, a war chest for something far more symbolic than any legal document could capture. The day after the verdict, I drove straight to the city planning office. I walked in with a manila folder under my arm containing the court ruling, my property deed, and the settlement payment confirmation. I knew exactly what I wanted and exactly where I wanted it. There was a patch of commercially zoned land right at the main entrance to the Maple Grove subdivision, a parcel that had been sitting vacant for months because the owner couldn't decide what to do with it. I made him an offer on the spot, cash, no contingencies, and by the end of the day, the paperwork was in motion. A week later, contractors were on site, and the HOA members who drove past probably assumed it was the beginning of another neat little business or landscaped feature to enhance the community. In truth, it was the beginning of their daily reminder that they had picked the wrong man to bully. I commissioned a 12-foot-tall steel billboard lit with floodlights, so it could be seen at all hours. In bold, all-capital letters stretching across the sign, it read, "Attention Maple Grove HOA. This land is not yours. Stay off IT. Paid for by James Carter Dock." To ensure there was no mistaking who it was directed at, I had the sign bordered with a parody of their own HOA logo, same shield outline, same fonts, but instead of their tidy little maple leaf emblem, mine had a pair of crossed nitrogen monoxide trespassing signs. The city planning office reviewed the design and confirmed it violated no ordinances, and because the land was now mine, the HOA had zero power to touch it. The reaction was immediate and glorious. My phone lit up with calls and texts, some from friends laughing themselves breathless, others from HOA members demanding I take it down. One even offered to negotiate a compromise if I removed the sign, but my response was polite and simple. No. I forwarded every complaint to the city zoning board, which reaffirmed that the sign was entirely lawful. Margaret, predictably, lost her composure. Within 2 days, she had called an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss the public defamation of the community and the degradation of neighborhood prestige. Unfortunately for her, by this point, her credibility within the board was already in tatters. The arrest, the court loss, and the $50,000 payout had turned many of her allies into quiet critics. Now she was asking them to fight a battle they couldn't win, with money they didn't have, and that was another thing. The HOA was broke. Between paying my damages, covering their own legal fees, and facing the possibility of higher insurance premiums after hiring unlicensed security, their once boastful budget had been gutted. The pet projects Margaret had been pushing, the expansion of the clubhouse, the installation of a gated second entrance, even the ridiculous proposal for community color compliance inspections, were all dead in the water. Residents who had never questioned her leadership before were suddenly voicing their frustration. I could see the cracks forming without even setting foot inside the HOA's meetings. Neighbors from within the subdivision would drive past my billboard, and depending on where they stood, either honk in support or glare with pursed lips. Local gossip circles, both online and in person, began to buzz with every new misstep. The arrest video, which had leaked thanks to someone at the sheriff's office, circulated on social media, showing Margaret arriving in her pristine SUV and arguing with Deputy Harris as her security officers sat handcuffed in the cruiser. It racked up thousands of views, and the comment sections were merciless. Margaret tried to weather the storm, but she underestimated the speed at which power can evaporate when people sense weakness. The board stopped returning her calls as quickly. The once friendly HOA newsletter omitted her monthly president's note for the first time in years. Rumors began swirling that a special vote to remove her was being organized. Then, one morning, I was sitting on my porch, sipping my coffee like always, when a moving truck rumbled past my driveway and into Maple Grove. I didn't think much of it until 10 minutes later, I saw it parked in front of Margaret's immaculate rule-compliant house. Over the next few hours, I watched from my porch as boxes and furniture were carried out, her carefully arranged potted plants loaded into the back, her yard slowly stripped of the decorative perfection she had so fiercely policed in others. Margaret emerged last, dressed in casual clothes for once, her hair tied back in a loose knot. She stood by the open door of her SUV for a long moment, staring out toward the entrance of the neighborhood and the billboard. I don't know what thoughts crossed her mind in that moment, but I saw her shoulders tense and her jaw tighten before she climbed into the driver's seat. When the SUV rolled past my property, she didn't slow down, didn't look my way, and didn't offer a word. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast anyway, watching as the vehicle disappeared down the road, the moving truck following close behind. Margaret Whitmore was gone. Her reign over Maple Grove was over. And the 12-foot reminder of that fact still stood, illuminated against the night sky, a permanent monument to the day an HOA learned that not everyone can be intimidated into obedience. The long echo of defeat, the weeks after Margaret's departure, brought a strange quiet to Maple Grove, a quiet that, at first, felt unnatural. For years, her presence had been as constant as the sunrise, a woman who thrived on inserting herself into every minor dispute, a figure who hovered over the neighborhood like a self-appointed queen. Without her, the HOA seemed to stumble forward in a daze, its leadership fractured, its confidence shaken. The billboard at the entrance still loomed like a sentinel, the bold letters glaring at every passing car, and though I stopped counting the honks and waves from people who supported me, I noticed the glares becoming fewer with each passing week. Word filtered through from friends who lived inside the subdivision. The special election to replace Margaret had been a bloodbath, not in the sense of violence, but in political terms. The very board members who once voted unanimously with her were now publicly distancing themselves, claiming they had been misled or pressured into supporting her reckless campaigns. The new HOA president was a man named Roger Bennett, a mild-mannered accountant who seemed far more interested in fixing potholes and balancing the budget than in waging war against non-members. Under his leadership, the HOA retreated to its legal boundaries like a beaten army pulling back to its walls. The dream of expanding into my land and anyone else's was quietly buried, but the damage Margaret had done to the HOA's finances was harder to undo. The $50,000 settlement they'd paid me was only the tip of the iceberg. Their legal bills had devoured tens of thousands more. Insurance premiums had spiked after the incident with the fake cops, and the board had been forced to cut several prestige projects. The proposed second gate? Gone. The ornamental fountain. For the clubhouse entrance? Cancelled. Even the seasonal community gala that Margaret had once boasted about in the local paper was reduced to a potluck in the park. The residents grumbled, not all of them knowing the full story, but enough knew to connect the dots. This was the fallout of arrogance. For me, life returned to a kind of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. No more violation notices taped to my fence. No more strangers with clipboards prowling the edge of my property. No more threatening phone calls trying to force me into compliance with rules I'd never agreed to. The security cameras remained, not because I expected trouble, but because they'd become part of my routine. And every so often, in the dead of night, I'd review the footage from my phone just to watch the empty road, the stillness undisturbed, and remind myself how far things had come. The billboard became something of a local landmark. People from outside the neighborhood would occasionally drive out just to take pictures with it, tagging them online with captions like HOA Slayer or Legend Lives Here. At first, I thought about taking it down after a year. I didn't want to seem obsessed or petty, but then I realized it wasn't just a personal trophy. It was a warning. A statement to anyone who thought they could trample someone's rights because they believed their title made them untouchable. One afternoon in late autumn, I was working in the garden when a woman I didn't recognize pulled her car onto the gravel shoulder just beyond my gate. She stepped out, a little hesitant, holding a small grocery bag. "Are you James Carter?" she asked. "That's me," I said, brushing dirt from my hands. She smiled faintly. "I live in Maple Grove. I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to them." People don't realize how much power they can try to take until someone pushes back. Margaret made life miserable for a lot of us. She handed me the bag, homemade bread, still warm. "This is just a little thank you." I accepted it with a nod. "I didn't do it for thanks," I told her. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But I appreciate this. She laughed softly. Well, you've got a lot more friends over there than you think. Even if some of them are too afraid to say it out loud. After she drove away, I stood for a moment, looking down the long stretch of road that separated my property from the manicured houses of Maple Grove. It struck me then that while Margaret had tried to make me a villain in her story, I'd ended up becoming something else entirely. A reminder that even in small town politics, power has limits and arrogance has a cost. Months turned into a year, and life settled into a steady rhythm. Every time I passed the billboard, its bold letters seemed less like a personal jab at Margaret and more like a permanent line drawn in the sand. Margaret herself was never seen in the area again. Rumors placed her in another state, perhaps already, sinking her claws into a new community that hadn't yet learned her tricks. But if that was true, I pitied them, because sooner or later, someone there would stand up just like I had, and when they did, they'd find that the blueprint for beating her was already written. As for me, I went back to my mornings on the porch, coffee in hand, the sun spilling over the tree line. My land, my rules. And after everything that happened, that simple truth tasted better than any victory could.